Hello. In this session, we'll take a look at Windows Virtual Desktop overview. Windows Virtual Desktop is an Azure service that allows you to deploy essentially remote desktop services on Windows 10, Windows 2016, 2012 R2, as well as 2019 in a fully managed way. So let's go ahead and get started. So Windows Virtual Desktop. And one of the unique features of Windows Virtual Desktop in Azure is that this allows for multi-session Windows 10. So this is really the only game in town and the only place where you can actually achieve that. If you roll your own and running Windows Virtual Desktops or already remote desktop services, your options are Windows 10 single user mode, or you can deploy a server OS and have multi-session that way. But the advantage of when you use Windows 10, if you have certain applications that only work properly in the workstation environment, it makes those compatibility issues essentially go away when you can leverage the multi-session Windows 10 option. So today what we'll go through is go through some of the prerequisites. So you do require Azure AD, you need an Azure AD tenant, you need an Azure subscription to deploy your host pools and your other resources associated with the Windows Virtual Desktop. And then also you need to have a global administrator account within your Azure AD tenant in order to actually register the Windows Virtual Desktop service, as well as connect it into your overall environment. So let's go through some of those steps. So Windows Virtual Desktop. And one of the unique features of Windows Virtual Desktop in Azure is that this allows for multi-session Windows 10. So this is really the only game in town and the only place where you can actually achieve that. If you roll your own and running Windows Virtual Desktops or already remote desktop services, your options are Windows 10 single user mode, or you can deploy a server OS and have multi-session that way. But the advantage of when you use Windows 10, if you have certain applications that only work properly in the workstation environment, it makes those compatibility issues essentially go away when you can leverage the multi-session Windows 10 option. So today what we'll go through is go through some of the prerequisites. So you do require Azure AD, you need an Azure AD tenant, you need an Azure subscription to deploy your host pools and your other resources associated with the Windows Virtual Desktop. And then also you need to have a global administrator account within your Azure AD tenant in order to actually register the Windows Virtual Desktop service, as well as connect it into your overall environment. So let's go through some of those steps. Getting started. So to get started, one of the first things that you need to do is you need to grant permissions to Windows Virtual Desktop Server and client applications within your Azure AD tenant. So here on the left, I have a link here that you can follow, and it will guide you to where you can go to actually enable that. And then once you have that enabled, um, you'll click on the log into your account, click on the link, and then you'll get presented with something very similar to what we see here. So on the left side, this is where I'm going and improving the virtual desktop server client. It will ask for certain permissions from various aspects of your Azure AD tenant. And then also one curiosity that I noticed there is that I got this message saying this application is not published by Microsoft or your organization, which is a little bit misleading since this is actually published by Microsoft, but the way they have it presented in Azure AD, I believe it comes up as like Windows Virtual Desktop as a service or something similar to that. So it doesn't actually show as Microsoft. So you get this warning letting you know of that. But as far as I can tell, it actually is published by Microsoft. It just doesn't match the error message. And you also get that once you go into register the Windows Virtual Desktop client that also needs specific permissions within your tenant to function properly. So once you have that all squared away, the next thing you need to do, you need to assign a tenant creator application role within your environment. So after you've registered the service to your tenant, What you want to do is go over to your Azure AD tenant. So if you're logged into the Azure portal, you can search for Azure Active Directory in the search bar. And then once you're there, you want to go to the Enterprise Application section. And then under Enterprise Applications, you should find a Windows Virtual Desktop. So once you find that, you'll see things related to like your application ID, the object ID that's associated with it. And then what you want to do, you want to actually go into your users and groups section. And from you want to add an assignment, right? So what you want to select an account that you have synced from your on-premise AD. Or I guess it could be a cloud-only account. I actually haven't tried that scenario, but in my scenario, my tenant is actually syncing. I'm using Azure AD Connect to sync my on-premise account up into Azure AD, and then I'm assigning permissions through the Azure portal to those on-premise account. So in my case, I went and selected an account that I wanted to have the tenant creator role, and I selected that user. And then I hit assign to grant it that permissions. All right, and then if you haven't added any additional users, you'll see something very similar to what we have here at the bottom. You'll see your original default access role assigned, which would have been created when you initially associated your Azure AD tenant to the Windows Virtual Desktop services. And then the previous step where we added assignment, in my case, I used the same account, and I granted that same account the tenant creator role. After it's all said and done, you see something very similar to this if you haven't granted any other permissions throughout the environment. All right, next thing you need to do. So next thing you need to do, you need to go ahead and get your Azure AD tenant ID. And there's a couple different ways where you can do that, but the easiest way for me is, again, if you're in the Azure portal, you can go and search for Azure Active Directory. And then once you're in your Azure Active Directory, just simply go to the overview section at the upper left corner, and that should be the default view that shows up once you log in. So once you go to overview, you should be able to see your tenant ID right there on the screen. So you want to, at this point, just go ahead and copy that and jot it down in a notepad, because you will need it in a later step. You'll need that ID. All right, next thing we want to do, we want to go and get our Azure subscription ID. So if you have a tenant that have multiple subscriptions, you want to be sure that you grab the subscription that you actually want your Windows Virtual Desktop to be associated with. You can have, well, I'm actually not sure, but I'm pretty sure you can have multiple Windows Virtual Desktop instances associated with different subscriptions throughout your tenant. We'll need to validate that. In my case, I only have, I think I have I have 3 subscriptions. I have 3 subscriptions, but I'm only going to associate my Windows Virtual Desktop with one of those subscriptions. So how to get to your subscription ID. Again, if you're in the Azure portal, one of the easiest way to do it is simply search for a subscription. And then once you're in your subscription view, right up at top at the overview section, you'll see your subscription ID. So again, you want to just go ahead and copy that down, throw it in Notepad, because you'll need it later at a later step in order to continue. All right, so now we're getting to the good stuff. So now what we want to do, we actually want to go ahead and create our virtual desktop tenant in our Azure AD environment. And so in order to do that, you do need to install a few additional PowerShell modules if you don't have them installed. So over here on the right, we have, we'll want to run these commands. So this first one, we'll go ahead and connect up and download the Windows Virtual Desktop PowerShell module and install it on your system. So once you have that installed, you in the same PowerShell window or in the ISE, I prefer the ISE, but you can do the same thing in the regular PowerShell. Or if you're using like Visual Studio Code or whatever have you, that wherever you're doing your PowerShell development at, you can use that. Now what you want to do is import the module. So you would just say import module name and provide that same name back to it. And then optionally, if you have a system where you've already installed that module, you may want to just go ahead and run the update module against that module name so you can update to whatever the latest version is at the time when you're going through these steps. Next, we want to actually create our tenant. So in order to do that, as I mentioned, we're going to have to run this add RDS account command, followed by deployment URL, and with this URL here. So this URL is rdsbroker.wvd.microsoft.com, and yeah, so that's the URL you need to specify. And once you run that command, you typically will be prompted for credentials. And when you get prompted, you want to make sure that you're using the account that you previously granted the tenant creator permissions. If you try to do it, say, with your regular global admin account that hasn't been explicitly granted these permissions, this step will actually fail. So just be sure you're actually authenticating to the Azure AD with the correct account when you try to run the command. So once you run it, you'll see something very similar to here. You'll see deployment URL. It'll show it. It'll get a tenant group name. So it'll say default tenant group. And then it'll also show the username that you use at deployment time there. So after you have that, now what we want to do, we want to create a new WVD tenant associated with the Azure AD tenant. And so how we do that, we do new RDS tenant and dash name, and then you give it a whatever you want it to be named. In my case, I'm using Lewis Tech Views will be the name. And then you want to do dash AAD tenant ID. And now this is where you're going to put in the Azure AD tenant ID that we acquired in the earlier step. So in my case, I'm not showing it in this view here, but I'm actually assigning that value to a variable named AAD ID. So I did $AAD ID equal then my Azure AD in quotes, and save that as a variable within my code. So I'm just passing the value of that variable into here. And then I did the same thing for the Azure subscription ID. I used the variable of sub ID and I assigned my subscription ID from our previous step. So once I have all of those things populated here, I'm going to go ahead and run that command. And then once you run it, you'll see something very similar to what we have here on the screen. You'll get some output saying tenant group name, default tenant group. You'll see your tenant ID. You'll see your tenant name. Some additional information there if those values are relevant for your particular tenant. If it's associated with any log analytics workspace, any shared keys, you'll see all that information outputted back to the screen there. All right, so now we have our tenant created. So let's move on. So now, this step is optional, but typically they do recommend that you assign an additional admin to the WVD tenant, just in case if you decide, let's say we're using that global admin account and we want to use like MFA or something like that on an account, we'll just want to have another optional way in order to how to get in and be able to manage our RDS or WVD services. So how we do that, we'll just run the new RDS role assignment dash tenant name, and we'll provide that same tenant name from our previous steps. So whatever you named yours, you'll specify there. So you can have, again, you can have multiple tenants. Each one can have a unique name. Then we do a sign-in name. And here I assign my sign-in name to a unique variable. So in my case, I use the sign-in name variable of sign-in name. So what that variable will contain would be the UPN of the user account that you're going to be using that you want to assign the permissions to. So in my case where I'm syncing my on-premise AD to my Azure AD, I'm using my username at domain.com or domain.whatever or domain.onmicrosoft.com, depending on how you have your UPN set up on your on-premise side. That's how it will reflect in Azure AD. And then you want to go ahead and specify the role definition name, and that name will be RDS owner is what you want to put there. So you go ahead and run that. Then again, as that command runs successfully, you get some output here as you see here on the screen, role assignment ID. That'll get put out on the screen. You'll see the scope. So default tenant group, as I mentioned, that's just a hard-coded name that it gives it when you create it. And then with my unique name that I put in for my tenant, and then various other information will get out. I'll put it to the screen to just let you know, hey, this command did run successfully. All right, so now we have our two admins that have permissions. We have our tenant connected. We have our Azure AD and WVD association. We have the Enterprise Application Association created. So now we're ready to continue on to the next steps. Now we're ready to create our host pool. So to provision a Windows Virtual Desktop host pool, one of the things you need to do, at least one of the issues that I ran into, is if you go to this regular search bar and search for Windows Virtual Desktop, you may not receive any entries. So what I actually had to do is actually click on Create a Resource and then search for Windows Virtual Desktop, and then it popped up. So once you find that entry, you'll see something very similar to this. Windows Virtual Desktop provision host pool, and on this screen you'll just simply want to click create, and that'll kick off the process. So once you click on create, that'll bring you to this wizard here. So one of the first things you want to do, so that'll land you on the basic section. So on the basic section, you want to go and select the subscription where you want to deploy your services to. You can either create a new resource group or use an existing one, and in my case I will be creating a new one. You want to go and select the region where you want your resources to deploy. So in this case, as far as what region you select, ideally you'll want to select it as close as possible to where your end users are. So if you have your end users are primarily in the East US, the East US region may be a good location for it, but it can really be anywhere where you need it to be, as long as there are resources available there. The latency differences will be, there will be some latency differences. So if all your end users are on the West Coast and you provision in East US, they may experience a little bit more latency contacting their services, but you can use either. You have to give the host pool a name, so just use whatever unique name you want to use. And then you have an option selecting the desktop type. You can either do pooled or personal. So the main difference is if you use personal, the first time a user logs in, whatever WVD desktop they get assigned to, that will become their permanent home where they'll connect to every time they connect. So that they will have their own personal desktop that'll belong just to them. When you use the pooled model, there will be a pool of resources available, and as a user come in, they will be assigned to whatever resource, whichever one is available and have capacity to accept that user. So just depending on what model you need, you can select either option. Next up, you need to select your default desktop users. You'll go ahead and specify the UPN of the users that you want to by default have access. So in my case, I'm just specifying two users from my on-premise environment that I'm going to be granting access to the environment here. And you can later add additional users and groups and things like that to control access. Just for this, I'm going to just be adding 2 users. And then finally, down here at the bottom, you can specify where your service metadata location should be. In my case, I'm going to be storing my metadata in the United States. So if you have any data sovereignty considerations, you want to make sure that you put it in the country that's relevant for that data, so you can be compliant. All right, and so next we'll move on to configuring virtual machines. So here you specify your usage profile. So there's 4 basic categories: light, medium, heavy, and power users. And under the covers, based on how it believes those users will behave and things they may do, it will provision larger virtual machines based on those requirements. And another configurable option is total users. So you can specify how many total users you're expecting to have, and then based on that, the database combined with the usage profile, it will estimate how many virtual machines you need as well as the size of those virtual machines. In my case, I'm saying I only have 10 users. So in that case, it's saying, hey, if there are 10 light users, I can just use one standard DV V3 virtual machines that has 4 vCPUs and 16 gigabyte of memory, and that should be enough for those 10 users. But if I needed more, I always can scale up to add additional resources to the pool. And finally here, you specify a virtual machine name prefix, so that can be whatever you want, and then it will increment the number as new servers join the pool. Let's move to our virtual machine settings. So for the virtual machine settings, and you have 3 different options. So you can provide your own image if you wanted to. So you had that image stored in blob storage somewhere, you can go and bring that in, or if you had a managed image. In my case, I'm just going to use one of the gallery images that's available. So I'm using the Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session that includes Office 365 Pro Plus. Then you have an option to specify your disk type. In my case, I'm just going to use standard HDD. So depending on what your users are using in a true production environment, you may want to use standard SSDs or premium SSDs to give more responsive reaction within the VMs from a disk perspective. Next up, we specify how we're going to join a domain. So the Windows Virtual Desktop service will manage joining these systems to the domain as they come online. So you need to specify an account that has domain join capability, and to specify that account here, username and password. And one thing to keep in mind is this wizard, say if your password policy on premise allows a password that only has 8 characters, that will actually be blocked here in the wizard. So you'll need to actually make that password longer in order to be able to use it with this wizard here. I believe it has a 12 character limit. If you're using an on-premise account for this setup, well, in this case, it will have to be an on-premise account for an AD domain join. That it needs to have at least 12 characters in the password, and maybe a few other restrictions as far as like uppercase, lowercase, maybe a number or a symbol in there to be accepted by the wizard. So just keep that in mind. If you get an error message, so you type in your password, it may tell you that it's not long enough. You'll have to go and adjust that on-prem, wait for it to sync to Azure AD, and then go ahead and put that password in, and you should be good to go. So the next thing you can do here is you specify the domain or OU that you want your systems to end up in as they join the domain. So in my case, I went ahead and specified the domain to join. Again, that's an on-premise domain. And then I went ahead and specified the OU where I want my systems to be staged in as they join my environment. Next up, we need to configure our virtual networks. So in these virtual networks, you can either create a new one, or it can already exist. And it also has to have network line of sight to a domain controller, to your domain controllers that are on premise or wherever your AD environment lives. If it's in Azure, if it's in the cloud, or if it's on prem somewhere, this virtual network has to have connectivity to that. So in my case, I'm going to use my Lab East Core virtual network. And then you have an option to, if that virtual network have multiple subnets, you'll be provided with a drop down where you can select what subnet you want to use. In this case, my virtual network does have multiple subnets, but I'm going to use this 100 underscore subnet that has already been pre-configured, and it has line of sight connectivity to my domain controllers that are on-prem. All right, so next here we want to just provide some basic Windows Virtual Desktop information. So here the main important part you need to put in is the Windows Virtual Desktop tenant name. So that would be the tenant name that we created at a way earlier step where we created our tenant. So one enhancement that I wish they would have here at some point is that it would have a drop down to show you what tenants have been deploy. That feature doesn't exist here in the wizard today, but that if you use user voice, that may be something you may want to try to vote for, and maybe the product group may see it and take that in consideration and make that an option here. But since it doesn't exist, you'll just have to manually type in that name. Next up, you can specify Windows Virtual Desktop tenant, who the owner of that will be. So you can either use a UPN or it can be a service principal. In my case, I'm just going to use a UPN, a regular account that lives on-prem. So I go ahead and put my UPN, username and password. And one thing to keep in mind in the case when you're using this UPN or a service principal, it cannot have an MFA policy on it, since it won't be able to interact and respond to like a phone call or a text message or anything like that. So you'll need to disable MFA on that account if it currently has it. So you probably want to use like a service account or something like that, as opposed to a user account where you may want to later down the road enforce MFA on there. All right, so once you have all of that specified, you go ahead and click next. That'll bring you to. So after review and create is fully finished, it's going to take a few minutes, several minutes to deploy everything, wire everything up, and deploy the virtual machines, add your users, join the domain. So you may be waiting a few minutes for all that to be done. But once it's done, you're now ready to connect. So to connect, you will need the Windows Desktop client. And one thing to keep in mind as far as Windows Virtual Desktop running in Azure, it does not support the remote app and connection clients built into Windows 10. It also does not support the remote desktop connection client or MSTSC client that's built into Windows of various version. And it also does not support the Windows remote desktop client that's available in the Windows Store. So you must install this newer Windows desktop client to support remote Windows virtual desktops. So what you see here on the screen, we have a link to where you can go and download the virtual desktop for Windows desktop client for the various versions of Windows 7, Windows 10, as well as there's clients available for like iOS, Android devices, and things like that as well. So once you have that downloaded and installed, you can just launch the client on your desktop, and then you would be presented with something very similar to this. It has a pretty clean interface. It'll say let's get started, and you'll see the subscribe button front and present and center there on the screen. So in order to connect, what you'll do, you'll just go ahead and click on the subscribe button. Then you'll get prompted for your username and password. You'll go ahead and provide that on the screen that you get. And then once you have that, you may see something very similar to what we're seeing on the screen here. You say you can use this account everywhere on your device. And you can also at that point in time allow your organization to manage my device. So if you're using your own like personal device, you may want to uncheck that box, so various different policies don't get pushed down on your system. But then depending on your organization, that may be a requirement where you may get potentially blocked if they have some type of conditional access policy that blocks certain type of devices from coming in. But the advantage of checking this box, it will help in having you to put in your password fewer times, username and password fewer times as you're interacting with the system. All right, so after you make that decision, you'll go ahead and say yes. And then you get presented with this screen saying, hey, you're all set. We've successfully added your account. And now you have access to the organization service. You'll just simply click done. And then from there, you'll get presented with something very similar to this here. So as you recall, as we went through, we made a tenant named Lewis TechView, so that you see at the top. And then at the bottom, we see our host pool that we named Worker PRIM-1. That can be named whatever you want it to be. If there's multiple host pools that you have associated with different worker groups, all of those will be available here, as well as if you had individual remote application exposed, those would also show in the view here. So you get a pretty clean, simplified view where you're using the new Windows Desktop Client app. All right, and then as far as going ahead and connecting into a pool, you'll just simply click on the icon there, and then you also have other options for connecting without installing additional software. So there is available of a HTML5 desktop or web client, virtual desktop web client that can be accessed at the URL you see on the screen here above, https rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com/web client. And that's supported across a wide variety of browsers, so it supports Microsoft Edge, Internet Explorer, Safari on Mac OS, Firefox and Chrome across Windows, Linux, as well as Mac. Most modern browsers are covered. So one that you see that's missing is Opera. I haven't tried Opera with it. It is HTML5 compliant, but I guess it's not officially supported. Doesn't mean it doesn't work, but you may run into some weird anomalies using that browser, or a browser like Brave or any other browser that you may be using. But since a lot of those derivative browsers do or are based on some parts of Chrome, you may have a good experience still, even though it's not officially supported. All right, so this is experience logging in with the web client. So as mentioned, you'll hit that rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com/web client link. You will get prompted for credentials. And then based on your credentials, you'll get presented with whatever your organization have exposed to your user account. So this is a single URL that will work across all organizations, essentially. It will pretty much query, activate Azure AD, figure out who your tenant are, what permissions you have, and then present back those applications in the portal here. So once you log in, as you can see, it looks very similar to what we saw on the Windows desktop client. And you may get prompted to say, do you want to allow local resources or not? Like, do you want to allow copy and paste between the remote client and your local client? Do you want to allow printers to pass through? Those type of things. So you can check the ones you need and then click allow. And then once you go and log in, this is kind of the experience. So you see it directly in your browser. It looks like it looks very similar to just what you're used to when you're RDP into a system. And then you're good to go. You can launch applications. You see here I have a few running. I have like Word running in the background. I have File Explorer running. I have an Edge browser running. You can see my desktop down at the bottom. So the experience is pretty seamless using the virtual desktop client, web client. And in a pinch, if like you're somewhere and you don't have permissions to like install the Windows desktop client on the system, this is another way how you can access that by going through the web client. All right. So we got everything deployed. We have our hosts up. We have our clients up. Our VMs are running. Our users are able to connect. And now, how do we manage this, right? As it's going, how do we scale it? How can we manage this as this environment scales? So this is where things get a little bit more complicated. So by default, there is no GUI. Right, there's no GUI that's available to manage all these things that we just did. We have to do it through PowerShell, and the same would apply if you're gonna scale the system out. You'll have to leverage things like ARM templates, PowerShell. You can do some things with Azure Automation or logic apps and things like that to like say, hey, after 5 users or 10 users log into this, maybe I want to spin up another VM and join it to the pool, right? You'll have to programmatically do all of those things. There's no easy button or GUI that'll allow you to do that. But what we're looking at here is this is a generic GUI application that Microsoft makes available that you can deploy within your tenant to help you manage your WVD tenants and your subscriptions. I won't go through here how to deploy this application. I do have a link here, but maybe in a future video we will go through and show you how you can deploy this. And once you have it there, how can you add additional hosts to your host pools, and manage that experience, because it's not as simple as that. Like you right click and say, hey, I want a new VM, and it goes and do everything and clone your VM or anything. It doesn't really work that way. There's a lot of additional plumbing and things that you have to unfortunately do yourself. But essentially, Windows Virtual Desktop takes off the burden of you managing like your web console for your virtual desktop services. It takes off the burden of you managing your connection brokers. It takes off the burdens of you managing any gateways. So the service itself handles all of those things for you, and we saw it managed joining the system to the domain and things like that as you bring them online when you leverage the wizard to build them. So hopefully this has been a decent overview of Windows Virtual Desktop for you, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.